You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hobb,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is George Wier. Well, here we are at episode 226 of the Author Stories Podcast. What did you think of the new intro? I've been working on that for a while and thought it was time to mix it up a little bit. We've had the same intro music for 225 episodes. Just thought it was time for a little change. So let me know what you think about it. Well, I don't have any comments to play for you today from listeners, but you can call 209-73-BOOKS and you can leave a comment like the one we had last week on the show. Maybe you've got a comment about a previous guest, or maybe an idea for the show, or maybe you have a tip on writing that you would like to share with the audience. The number is 209-73-BOOKS. We have so many shows lined up for you. I've mentioned on Facebook that my wife Dawn has taken over scheduling the show, and man, is she doing a phenomenal job. She has really shows booked up through the end of the year, and it's amazing what she's been able to accomplish in a short time of helping me with the show, and I think you're going to see the show benefit greatly from having her on board. So thank you, Dawn. I'd like to tell you about some sponsors this week. Pico's House. Hey, authors, if you want to take your book to the next level, and I mean A1 level, where people are going to notice your book and fall in love with it and not be distracted by all the pitfalls that, we as authors fall into. The creative aspect is so important, but having someone that has your back, that can notice all of the little things that fall through the cracks because you've stared at the manuscript so many times, that's where a great editor comes in. And Crystal Pico Watanabe is one of the very best in the industry. She's edited over 70 novels and novellas and 130 short stories, and she comes recommended by best-selling authors such as Hugh Howey, Sam Peralta. Most of the experience she has is with science fiction, speculative fiction, and middle grade, but she is a fantastic editor for any genre because she has the eye that you're looking for. Go visit picoshouse.com. Let her know that you heard about it on Author Stories, and she'll give you a discount. That's Crystal Watanabe, one of the very best editors. Your book will benefit from having Crystal on your team. Galactic Satori Chronicles, written by Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks, is a raucous sci-fi adventure that you don't want to miss. If Book 1 Earth and Book 2 Kron are out, this fantastic joyride of science fiction adventure you're going to love. There's a link to it in the show notes. Our good friend Richard Fox has The Ember War. It's a 9-book series. He was on the show just last week talking about it. Go back and listen to that show. Go pick up The Ember War. If you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber like I am, you can read through them for free right on your Kindle. And there's some of the best military sci-fi you'll ever read. As a matter of fact, Richard's spin-off series, Iron Dragoons, it won the Dragon Award at this year's Dragon Con for military sci-fi. Richard Fox, The Ember War. It's a near future. Alien probe arrives on Earth with a pivotal mission, determine if humanity has what it takes to survive the impending invasion by a merciless armada. This is fun military sci-fi. You're going to get in and love it, I promise. That's Richard Fox, The Ember War. R.A. McCandless book, Tears of Heaven, Flames of Perdition, Book 1. A child of angels and humans, Dell is a sarcastic, fast-talking, dangerous, and unpredictable demon hunter. She and her partner, Marin, take their orders directly from an angel. They obey or they'll be destroyed. It's not the job Dell wants, but it's the job she has. This book, if you're a fan of Dresden Files like I am, or other kind of paranormal urban fantasy, you are going to fall in love with this book. R.A. McCandless has a way with painting the setting, and it feels like you're there while keeping the action high. He makes you care about the characters. I love this book so much. I'm so happy that R.A. McCandless is a sponsor of the show. I really want you to go pick up this book, Tears of Heaven, Flames of Perdition, Book 1. Ed Gosney's blog, Cool Comics in My Collection, has over 100 entries now. So much good stuff that Ed is doing. I think he just had his 2nd anniversary. I think he posted. I think his His post this week is talking about the second anniversary of Cool Comics in my collection. You can find it at edgosney.com. And one thing that I love about Ed's blog is he reminds me of why I love comics and why I started reading comics. Ed has this nature that when he loves something, you can't help but love it too. And he really brings out what it is about comics that resonates with us as readers and as writers and just as humans. He takes an interesting look at collecting comics, maybe some that are in his collection, maybe some that got away. But there's always something interesting. I learn something every week. Find it at edgosney.com. And while you're there, why don't you pick up one of Ed's novels? He's one of the absolute best novelists I've ever known. edgosney.com. Oceans, the anthology, is available for pre-order right now. It actually goes on sale September 26th. That's going to be next Tuesday. And I actually have a special show for you for launch day with Daniel Arthur Smith and Risa Walker, where we talk about Oceans, the anthology. You can get it right now for 99 cents. There's 12 authors, amazing collection of stories. Even if I do say so, I have a story in it called Siren Song of the Mississippi Queen. And these are stories based around our love of the ocean, the thing that draws us there as humans. No two stories are alike. There's an interesting take from everybody, and I think you're going to love it. Authors, you need a website. You need a web presence. This is not debatable. If you're going to compete in today's marketplace, you have to be represented on the web. ThirdScribe.com can help you do that. Rob and all the great folks over there have just revamped it with the 4.0 edition of Third Scribe. He has outdone himself. The whole team has. And you know what? If you are a Third Scribe user or know someone who is, one thing that you will hear over and over again is how Third Scribe really steps up with support for their authors and their users. You'll find no one else that gives authors the support that Third Scribe does. Go check them out, ThirdScribe.com. As always, if you'll stay tuned at the end of the show, we've got a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have George Wier on the show with me. George is one of the most prolific writers that I have encountered in quite some time. His long-running, and it's long-running for a reason, Bill Travis mystery series is going like gangbusters. And George writes these really unique books set in the great American West, and they contain all of that flavor. And George, welcome to the show today.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it as well. I begin each show with the same question.
Uh-oh.
And that question is, it's a doozy, so be ready. What is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Oh, shoot. Well, okay, you're catching me. You're catching me off guard here, but that's perfect. I can answer this one. I would say that it was when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I would take 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper and tear them or cut them, and I'd fold them and crisp them, and then separate them or cut them in half with scissors, and then staple them 3 staples along the spine, and then I'd draw a cover on the front and with a crayon or art pencil, something like that, and I would write the story inside and show it to people, and that was publishing. And that was it. And I'd show them around, give them to people or whatnot. So, I'd say it's around 7 years old.
That's awesome. Were you an early reader?
I was. Now, I do recall that I had just a tad of dyslexia when I was a little fellow. In fact, it really foobarred me pretty well. There was, for instance, the word was. I read it as saw, and
Yeah.
so the sentences didn't make a whole lot of sense, but I would try and grok the best I could from it. Then later, comic books. I ran into comic books, and oh boy, I was off to the races. But my dad influenced me a whole lot. He had this elaborate library. I remember when I was knee high to a jackrabbit, we had Plutarch's Lives on our shelf, believe it or not,
Nice.
reading about the Romans. And we also had books on Texas history, and I really immersed myself in that. You know, Texas is one of the few states that has an entire genre devoted to its history, and it's a big genre. And I immersed myself in those books. And then by the time I was 12, 13 years old, I was reading Richard Adams, like Watership Down and whatnot. And Tolkien. I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, I think by the time I was 11 or 12. And I just, even though I didn't know all the words, well, I would immerse myself in those books. So I was an avid reader. I guess I'd read a few hundred books by the time I was 13 or 14 years old.
I had a similar struggle with dyslexia when I was younger, and comic books to me were one of the things that really helped me as well. So I love hearing that other people had a similar experience. But I figured, the story about your dad and his library, I figured there had to be some influence there if one of your first memories is making books. And, so your dad and his library were a tremendous influence on you.
It was. We were, my dad was a person of the book. My mom, not so much. But my dad really appreciated fine things. He appreciated fine music. I remember working with him he'd go and buy an old Victrola, and we would sand that thing down and revarnish it and smooth it out and make it look and sound wonderful. And we'd have 78 RPM records, Lily Pond's Orchestra, and Paderewski, and Chopin's Preludes. And also, we would he would make bookshelves. And usually he'd make them for us, but occasionally other people would demand to have bookshelves. And my dad was a jack of all trades. He could do anything. And
he was a Renaissance man.
He was very much a Renaissance man in a small East Central Texas town of about 3,500 people, and everybody knew him. And I knew all the neighbors. I could go anywhere in that town, and it was just my oyster. And so I was exposed at a very formative age to the classics. There was Charles Dickens, and which to this day I still can't really read. But I was exposed to all this stuff, and my dad was just very, very influential. And of course, he introduced me to all this New Age stuff. When I was about 14, 15 years old, I just threw myself into New Age literature and alternative religion type stuff, Far East philosophies. Boy, I just sucked all that stuff up, and even that comes out in my writing these days. Just a little slightly philosophical.
Yeah, I love to hear about people's influences, because you're right. You read a writer in a particular genre, and a lot of times you may have this person pegged in your mind as to kind of what this person's about. And then you start kind of peeling back the layers, and what really makes someone stand out in a genre a lot of times is that there are these odd influences that you wouldn't necessarily think, but all those things go into the writing that makes this thing in this genre stand out from all the others, because, but it's kind of like a good gumbo. There's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but when it all coalesces, it makes something fantastic.
Yeah, that's really true. And I look for that in other authors, that it's not just, the cover of the book is not what necessarily you're going to read, but there's some depth and some dimension, and it's going to be really rich in that world that this author has created. I actually have to be careful when I read other authors, so that I'm one of these kind of people. I'm one of these kind of people that I could get into a cab and there'll be the cab driver, and he's from South Africa or he's from wherever, and I could be going down the road, and within 5 minutes I'm mimicking his accent, and I'm doing it unconsciously. And I will do that with writing. When I read someone else's writing, their style, their turn of a phrase will influence me, and I'm like, ooh, well, wait a minute here. I need to be very original, and so I actually have to watch that. It's an asset. It's a wonderful asset, because that's really all that we as authors or artists do this to. Creators of any ilk will look around the physical universe around them, their world, and they will mimic what they see. And really, in the final analysis, that's all anyone. The only skill that we as beings really have is to duplicate the physical universe. So that you have an interesting point there.
George, very few people set out, when they leave school and go out into the world and pursue being a writer, and that's the only thing that they ever pursue. What did you do when you left school and kind of got out on your own?
Well, I've tried many things. I've done probably dozens or possibly even 100 different little professions. If you've ever read any Louis L'Amour, you know that he was a jack of all trades long before he ever started writing. I think he was even a pugilist at one time. He was a boxer. All of these different authors have had very diverse backgrounds. Mine is no exception. I took orchestra at Sam Houston State University my first year out of high school, and I decided I didn't want to do that because it was excruciating, all that practice and everything. And I was like, well, maybe this is not for me. And then I went into real estate, selling real estate. That was a flop. I was an utter failure. I am not a good salesman at all. If somebody doesn't want something, well, I don't want to push it on them. And so that ultimately failed. And I'll say that I'll go out on a limb here and say that if a person is not following their real purpose in life, then they're just not going to succeed. They'll make certain in their own way that they don't succeed because it's really not their purpose line. You really have to find out what you want to do and do that, because then you'll put all of your energy, all of your drive behind it, and you'll get behind it. You'll really push, and it will just work out. Things will work out for you somehow magically. But really, it's that energy and that drive, behind you pushing. And let's see, real estate. I've done. What about, I worked in a shoe store selling shoes at one time. I've taken census. I used to carry a rolling straight edge across the country to measure the bumpiness of highways for highway projects. I remember being out in West Texas. Here I am, 25 years old, pushing what it's called a profilograph down I-20 between in the Permian Basin between I forget the names of the towns out in West Texas in the hot sun, with nothing but flat plain all around you. For miles, I'd push that thing and it'd measure the bumpiness of the roadway and whatnot like that. So I've done that, and consequently, I got to go down just about every Texas highway there is. And so that gave me kind of the beginning of the basis for the Bill Travis Mysteries, because you have to have been to the places that you're describing in order to do it justice. I mean, you can, to a certain extent, look online and get all the data nowadays. But
Yeah, but that's not the same as you can do that, yes, but there's it's just not the same as walking through there, and but because what you can't get from Google Maps is what that particular smell is in early May, or or what the West Texas dust smells like, or what a sunset looks like.
Right, you cannot, and consequently, Sally, my wife, and I have had to get in the car on a Friday after drive all weekend, and then maybe part of the next week, when we had to be back to work, and drive to like Caddo Lake in deep East Texas, right on the Louisiana border. For my book Caddo Cold, we took 3 trips to that place to make sure that I had it all just right, even after I wrote the book, just to tweak it a little bit, to make sure it was just perfect. And I'll say, and I'll go out on a limb here, just from my own point of view, and say that book perfectly describes Caddo Lake. Caddo Cold, which is, I think, Bill Travis number 7. Bill Travis number 6 is Slow Falling, and we drove all the way out to Kermit, Texas, in the armpit of Texas out there, in the extreme West Texas, and they have the sand hills out there. Well, I had heard about the sand hills, but I had never seen them, so we had to go out there and just take a look-see, and damned if I'm, wasn't right in my early writings about that, but it's sort of a beach without an ocean. Sand dunes everywhere, and you can't tell. If someone were to plop you down the middle of that, you wouldn't know if you were in the Mojave Desert or if you were, where. And so
that's a great description, the beach with no ocean.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, if you live in Lubbock, which is up on the Cap Rock, which is, the Llano Estacado, it's all flat land. It's all flat farmland. Well, there's not a whole lot to do on it. And so people will get in their cars and they'll drive to the sand hills, or if you live like in Littlefield or one of those small towns, there's no big lakes where you can go boating. So they'll get a couple of 6-packs of beer and load the wife and the kids in the car, and they'll drive to the sand hills, and they'll spread a blanket and treat it like it's the beach, but there's no water, there's no ocean. It's an actual attraction. They do that to this day. It's quite interesting.
Wow, that is interesting. So you mentioned Bill Travis and the Bill Travis mysteries. I think they're 15 volumes now.
That's correct. About to be 16. Yeah.
Man, that's amazing, and I've read a couple of them, and they're fantastic. You've said several things that I want to try to highlight here. You talked about Louis L'Amour and how he was kind of a jack of all trades, and you could definitely tell that in his writing because, like we said, he'll make a passing reference to something, but you know that it's a reference that he knows something about. And maybe there's just a line or two, that goes into the writing, but that line or two lends authenticity, that, like we said, Google Maps, can't give you. I can't help but think that Bill Travis is very closely connected to you. But where did Bill come from? And you also mentioned earlier that that there's this whole genre of Texas history and Texas stories, and all those things kind of, roll up into these great books. So when did Bill Travis come into your life?
Oh, wow. Well, that's a very loaded, multifaceted question. That's,
sure it is.
Some parts. But let me see if I can hit the ground running with this. Okay. So I'm going to go back to what you were saying about Louis L'Amour. So Louis L'Amour, he wrote his book. I think it was Confessions of a Wandering Man or something like that, or Yondering. I forget what he called it. But his readers knew that they were reading about a place that he had actually himself stood. He had been there. He had seen this. You could take any of his little short stories, one that I recall called Trap of Gold, and it's about a guy that runs across a gold vein at the bottom of a cliff of a big standing rock. Well, at any moment the rock could collapse if he tried digging the gold out, so it became a real trap for him because he could get crushed by 10,000 tons of rock. So you knew that he had been there. He had seen that thing. He had seen that obelisk there. And so I don't always necessarily, have walked at that exact place, and certainly wasn't flying in the air in a helicopter in that location. But I do the best I can to make sure it's exactly accurate from my memory. And if I don't remember it well enough, I will get in the car and go there. So yeah, that's that point there. And also with regard to when Bill came into my life, it was 2004, I think it was. In 2002, I left my life behind me. 30 years I lived in Bryan College Station, Texas. You probably heard of it, home of the Aggies and whatnot, Texas Aggies. And I had immersed myself in that community, that area, while I was divorced. I was looking around at the world. Everyone that I knew had moved away. My family had dispersed. My sisters were gone. My mom and dad were no longer in that town. It was just me, and I had just divorced, and so I didn't have anything, holding me there. So I called up a friend who lived in Austin and said, why don't you move to Austin? I've got a spare room for you. This is where artists, I know you're going to be an author. Why don't you move in here? So I with a borrowed truck, with the clothes on my back, and I think I had one book with me, which was The Silmarillion, which has always stood with me whenever I had things were really bad. I would read The Silmarillion. I just immersed myself in that. So I moved to Austin, and then my fortunes changed. Things started getting better for me. One day I was looking in bookstores. It was on a Saturday. I was looking for books to read, and I couldn't find a really good action, adventure, mystery, and sort of the pulp magazine, style of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I couldn't find anything like that. And I went bookstore to bookstore, and I was like, what is this? And then it dawned on me at one point. It was in a half-price bookstore on South Lamar in Austin, and I was looking through the stacks there, and I said, well, if I can't find what I want to read, I guess I'm going to have to write it myself. And then I was like, wait a minute, what? What did you just say? And so I went home, and I wrote, I started the first Bill Travis book, The Last Call, which went through 9 different drafts ultimately before it was published, or before I put it out there. But that book was first written in first person presence, like I walk over to the door and open the knob, and turn the knob, first person present tense. Well, a very good friend of mine, fellow author, and later we co-authored together. His name is Milton T. Burton. He's since deceased, but wonderful guy. He read that. The first thing he asked me was, "Bert, why did you write this book?" No one else was going to write it. I had to write it. He said, "Well, it's wonderful, but this first person present tense is a little pretentious for a first author. I think you need to, I think you need to change that." Well, a few years later, it became all the scene that you write a book in first person present tense.
Yeah.
And but I took his advice. I went ahead and changed that, and I actually rewrote the latter half of the book completely, tossed out the original storyline and rewrote it completely, and went through various drafts, and then finally it was published. But Bill Travis is an amalgam of who I would have been had things been different. The types of adventures that I would have had, and some of them I did have. I've had more close calls and close scrapes than about anybody I personally know, including some cops. I have, landed airplanes in direction, with the wind. I have, some of these books. I mean, obviously, I haven't dangled from a blimp and pull the statue off the top of the Capitol building or anything like that. But yet. But I'll tell you, it's a little bit safer to sit at your computer and write these stories than it is to go out and do some of this stuff. And I no longer take nearly as many risks as I used to.
Bill Travis, these books are set in Texas, I think for the most part, or at least they're rooted there. I think it's probably safe to say. What is it about Texas that holds the imagination of readers? And there was even a New York Times article that I found where you're mentioned in, and it's listing all of these authors who are writing Texas stories, and they highlight you in it as kind of one of the standouts of this genre. What the heck? What is it what is it about Texas that seems to be this magical place in readers' imaginations?
It's mostly mythology, but it's mostly mythology, but there's a kernel, like everything. There's a kernel of truth to it. So going back to when, Davy Crockett was standing before the Tennessee Senate or what have you, and he said, "You may go to hell, and I will go to Texas." I mean, Texas was always that place that if you were running from someone or something, or you had you were wanted by the law back east or something like that. Or you just wanted to go establish a homestead somewhere, well, it was just wide open. It was the frontier. It was huge. It was grand in scope. It was so huge it would swallow anyone in their entire history and not hiccup. And you got everything. You've got you've got like mangrove swamps down on the coast, and you've got these wetlands everywhere, with fine game, fishing and whatnot, and you've got these verdant forests with tall pines, and you've got the mountains out in West Texas. You've got desert and sand and Gila monsters and sidewinder snakes, and you've got the plains up north where the grass just went on forever. The beginning of the Great Plains starts down around Spring, Texas, and goes north all the way to Wyoming and Nebraska and almost to the Dakotas. It's just you've got Colorado and Kansas and all that stuff in there in between. It's just grand and scope. And at one time, Texas went all the way up to Wyoming. The very, very old 1836 map of Texas, when Texas was formed, it went all the way up there. I have an attorney friend who recently took a trip and outlined the old boundary of Texas, and he walked it with some friends of his. And it's that big at one time. It was huge, and that mythology is still very much alive. And you've got the Texas Rangers, one riot, one ranger, and so I weave the Texas Rangers into my. Bill is he's a special ranger. I mean, he's and we have special rangers today, and I've known Texas Rangers, and they're just the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. But yeah, Texas is bigger than all of us.
Some people that might read your books and get you write mysteries and thrillers and of course they have this Texas flavor and stuff. But you talked earlier that your stalwart companion through the years had been this copy of the Silmarillion. How do those fantasy stories of Tolkien, and granted they are very much adventure stories at their core in a lot of ways, but how do those things factor into the kinds of writing that you do?
Well, I'll tell you. So one project that I'm working on right now called Isherwood, and I don't know if this book will ever get finished. I'm not quite at the halfway point on this book, and it's already like 80,000 words. It is just huge. It's grand in scope. But even in the Bill Travis books, there's always an element of the unexpected. There's almost always some kind of element of fantasy. I'll even kick in every now and again a little science fiction. Some of my mystery readers that are purist mystery readers, they'll email me and they'll say, I really prefer you just to stay away from the fantasy and the science fiction and just write straight mysteries. But even those are good. But, for me, would you just write a straight mystery, pretty please? and I'll do that. But there are 2 or 3 of them that are way out there. We have, like it's sort of a joke back in the 70s. If you had a TV show like The $6 Million Man or something like that, ultimately there would always be an episode about either UFOs or Bigfoot,
Right.
Consequently, I had to have a Bigfoot Bill Travis book. And I did.
Of course you did.
And I put it out there, but it's always, if I do something like that, it's never going to be what anyone expects. It's going to be a different take, a different flavor than you've ever seen. And if I can't do that, I'm just not going to do that. That type of story.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that your dad kind of turned you on to some alternative ways of thinking with some new age stuff and Eastern mysticism, religion, and things like that. How did those things and the interest in those things factor into your writing?
Well, they factor in this way. So every chance I get, I give my protagonist and the characters, I give them a dilemma or a choice. Usually it's a choice of which way to turn. It's an ethical thing. They'll have a conundrum or something that they've got to figure out. And so they're hit with an ethical question, and it shows their character by what path they take. Also, there's the spiritual side, and I can't really discount this at all. The spiritual side is that the fact of the matter, and I don't think it matters what religion a person is, but all religions have, and all philosophies basically have this one thing in common. It's the brotherhood of man and oneness with the universe. And I at every turn, I attempt to manifest in my writing some aspect spiritual. It may be that my main character decides that the danger to myself, the danger to this body, is acceptable because the ethics of the situation are that I must do this thing because that's more important than my immediate life. Because in the final analysis, we're not these bodies. A person goes on. My own personal philosophy is that we live multiple lives. Actually, it's all one life, and we manufacture death by forgetting. but it's and we are timeless. It's sort of like this, and without delving too deeply into philosophy, did this big spiritual being who supposedly created everything, did he create all the souls at one time way back in the beginning, or is he every time some punk knocks up some 15-year-old girl, is he creating a new soul at that moment? So if your answer is that, well, he created all the souls at one time, well, where have they been? So and what are they doing? Or are they jumping from body to body, life to life? It's sort of like quantum leap. My own personal philosophy is that we, and I have memories from when I was 3 and 4 years old of for instance, fighting in the Roman arena. Well, hell, I didn't have a TV set at that time. I'd never seen a movie in a theater. When I had these memories, these dreams, or what have you, and I pegged all this stuff exactly, in that memory, and without being exposed to. I mean, we didn't have a TV set until the moon shot in 1969. My dad brought home a TV set, and we were able to see the moon shot on TV.
Wow!
But before that, I was remembering these past lives. I try to weave if not stating that exactly, I try to at least weave the philosophy into my writing of that this existence is not the most important thing in the world. Your integrity to yourself is far more important than your life.
Yeah, I think you're right there. And before anyone thinks that we're getting a little heady talking about that sort of stuff, and that your books do tackle some scary situations and things like that. But one thing that runs through your writing is a sense of fun, and that when you sit down with a George Wier book, your eyes are going to be open to a lot of things, but you're going to have fun along the way. How, when writing these long series that you do, how do you, one, keep the books interesting to yourself as a writer so that you can keep writing them, but how do you keep your reading audience engaged and keep them coming back for more?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because it's really easy to box yourself into a corner when you're writing a series or something like that. You can, sure. I'm not there are people that have to outline everything that they write so that they'll know what the next thing is, so they'll be able to write it, right? So with a good friend of mine, Craig Johnson, who writes the Walt Longmire series, he and Judy came to town here just I guess about 2 weeks ago, and we went out to dinner with them. But
Craig's been on the show twice.
Oh, he has.
Yes,
he's a great guy. I really like him.
Love it.
He blurbed my book Long Fall from Heaven, and it just really got good reviews, and really owe him big for that. He says I don't owe him anything, but I'm intent on going up to his ranch in Wyoming and cutting firewood for him. In fact, I've got a promise to do so. But anyway, to your question, what I do when I'm writing these books is that I don't know what's going to happen next. I do know that it's going to be a shock. It's going to be a surprise. It's going to surprise me, and then, for instance, I'll write a chapter, and I'll finish that chapter, and I'll print it, and I'll take it to Sally. I'll take it to my wife immediately for her to read, and when I walk in, I'll hand her the papers, and I'll say, "You will never guess what just happened." And actually, I try to end my chapters on just a little bit of a cliffhanger to catapult you into the next chapter, and because people will do this. They'll be reading. It'll be late at night, and they've got to work the next day. And I'm merciless this way. I should be shot. But what I'll do is I will end the chapter such that they can't help but turn the page because I want to know what's going to happen next. And I'll write it like that. Yeah, it's savage. It's merciless. I really.
but it's good writing because if you write a book and you have the most important things in the world to say, but you don't write it in a way that someone wants to keep reading it, you haven't done anything.
Right. The one thing you don't ever want to do is preach.
Right.
So I don't. You do want to impart some kind of morality, some kind of moral lesson in everything, or at least I do in everything I do. Because if I'm not doing that, I don't feel like I'm writing. I feel like I'm playing a game or something like that. You've got to at least do that. And so I try to do that at every turn. I don't always succeed, but that's the thing for me.
Well, you said you don't work from an outline, and you kind of discover the story as you're going. Some people think that if they did that, they would never finish anything because they need that roadmap to keep them pressing forward. You are such a prolific author, though, that obviously is not a problem for you. Do you ever run into roadblocks where you're just like, I just don't know what's going on, and you get stuck?
Oh, hell yes, I do that. Oh, are you kidding? That is one of the pitfalls and one of the traps of it's one of the things that you have to expect. It's just part of the trade. For me, and that's not to say I've never outlined anything, but if I'm going to outline something, it's going to be in bullet format. It's like I might write like one little sentence or just a few words, say what this next chapter is about. I very rarely even do that. But when sometimes I'll jump around, particularly when I'm getting to about the halfway point in a book. All of a sudden, full blown, like from Zeus's head, cloven in half, this thing will happen. It'll be obviously near the end of the book or at the very end of the book. Well, all my attention just goes to that. I'm like, oh, well, geez, I have to write this now. And so I'll go ahead and write that. I'll write that chapter or that scene or those 2 chapters or whatever. And then I might like, well, I need to set that up a little better. And so I'll write the chapter right before the end after having written the end. And then I'll jump back to where I was in the narrative. And then I'll write something in the middle and then it'll stitch it all together. That occasionally happens. Normally for me, it's a narrative. It just happens as it happens. But sometimes this current Bill Travis book, I've already written the ending of the book. Right now I'm stitching it together and I'm hoping to have it out in the next week, 2 weeks. I keep saying that, but I've got things in life standing in my way. The other thing about this method of writing, what you have to do, because you are going to run into roadblocks if you're just pants in the wind, flying by the seat of your pants type of writer. It's a chance. You're taking a chance, that you're focusing on something that may not pan out. It's sort of like panning a river and finding no gold. Well, what I do is I have multiple projects going at once. And if I hit a wall on one, I can jump to the other one and take off. And then by the time I've done some on that, then I might, have enough gumption to go back and finish that other book. And so I'll have many projects going at once.
I kind of like that idea. I think maybe the prevailing wisdom is, work on one thing at a time so that you don't dilute, the thing you're working on. But I usually have 7 or 8 things rolling around in my head at once. And I don't know how many times I sit down to write the thing I'm supposed to be writing. And all I can think about is this other thing. And, maybe you should, press pause on what you're working on. Go get that other thing off your mind, at least. And and come back to the thing you're supposed to be doing. You know, I kind of like that idea.
Yeah. Well, it has evolved over time, and that's sort of my modus operandi now. The truth, people that likes to break things down to their fundamental. I try and bring it. You know, what's the old thing about this guy's got some kind of great philosophy or something. Well, you've just written a book. Okay, well, summarize it to a chapter. Okay, well, now summarize it to a paragraph. Now summarize it to a word. And I do that. So my summary of that philosophy about multiple projects is this. A book is only written one word at a time. You can't write you can't write anything other than one word at a time on a book. So there's this is almost so simplistic that it sounds stupid, but it's those little simple stupid things that make for success in life, and the God is in the details. So for me, if I don't care if it's a sentence, a paragraph, a chapter, 5 chapters. I'm going to work on one as the gumption is there, or as the energy behind it, the interest in it is there, until that's exhausted. I will not press on past that point. Also, I am fundamentally the laziest person I know. Now, a lot of people don't believe that because I'm, quote, so prolific. But if I have to expend energy on a project, if the energy from the project does not propel me forward in and of its own inertia, then I'm going to stop and I'm going to work on something else. Because it's not the writing is never when I'm pushing it, trying to push that envelope, trying to force it, the writing is never honest. It really is not, and I have to stop at that point. And I've got books. I've got books that will probably never be written because I went too far past the point where I was really interested in it and tried to push it. I need to go. What I need to do is go back and chop those off where that problem began, and see if I can rekindle that old purpose, and then see if it's good enough to go forward with. But until and unless I have that, then there's no point.
Well, and sadly, as readers, I think we've all read books that were written past their purpose when the writer should have stopped and went and written what they were passionate about at the time instead of what they were maybe obligated to write.
Yeah, they just didn't want to. It's actually an ethical point. The ethics of the situation is that I know that I should not do this thing. However, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. That's ethics has gone out the window at that point, and that's really all that ethics is knowing what you know, knowing what everybody knows instinctively what's right and what's wrong, what they should do, what they shouldn't do, and there is, I dare say, there is or should be ethics in everything you do. And there's definitely ethics in writing. And I'm not the most ethical guy in the world. I would just put that out there and say that. I've had some really spotty things in my life. But I'm just saying, with regard to this, it's so important to me that I get it and get it right. That otherwise I'm lost.
Yeah. George, before we started recording, you and I were just chatting, and it sounds like you have a tremendous amount of work in the hopper that's all going to kind of explode at one time, it sounds like. What are you working on now, and what can people expect from you?
Okay, well, just real quick. So the next Bill Travis book is called Reveille in Red. I'm hoping to have that out in a couple of weeks. It's a book about Bill Travis and Julie. I include her in on this adventure. Are touring wine country because there's an unsolved murder at a winery, and it's all about competing wineries and bad things happen. as they're wont to do. I'm also working on a historical. Of course, I change history, and this is the one instance where I'm not actually planning to go there to that place, but because it's not on this continent. In fact, it's its own continent. Nobody lives there. It's a historical 1888 adventure about exploring Antarctica. Well, Antarctica wasn't discovered until 1906. Yet there historically are records of Antarctica on old maps and stuff like that, even though it's not, quote, official or what have you. But it's an attempt to get to the South Pole, but there are other reasons involved, and it's a very brutal book. I'm past the halfway point on that. And
are there any aliens in that book?
There are not, or at least.
Dang it, George!
At least there are not yet. It's not that type. It's not that type of book, but it's 1888, and there are these people on this adventure down there, and they have to. There's an erupting volcano. There's a lot of fire and ice in this book. There's a brutal killer that's killing the party one at a time as they get closer and closer to their goal. There's this obsessed madman of an expedition leader. There's these two former Civil War veterans that were on. Each one was on a different side in the Civil War, but they kind of team up, and it just that's going. Actually, there are 11 projects right now. Isherwood is the one I was talking about, the fantasy. Briefly, I mentioned it's a fantasy book. It's going to be huge in scope. 1904 Journey in Time is a steampunk book I'm writing with Billy Crane. I will get that one finished. I'm also co-authoring one with T.R. Harris, who's very popular. His Human Chronicles saga is very popular, but we're writing the first book in this series that he and I are doing together was Captain's Malicious. It's about space pirates. And this next book is called Captain's Malevolent. It's just that's sort of a takeoff on Captain's Courageous, Captain's. Yeah.
Right.
And then I'm working on a thing called Unto the Night, which is just a series of short stories, which I'm almost done with that. The third book in the Elysium Chronicles, I'm working on that right now. It's called Elysium Nights. I'm working on a sequel to the first book in the Shelby Knight Chronicles. The first book was called Errant Knight, and the second book is called The Reluctant Templar. And let's see, Boland's War, which is going to be actually a sequel to A Long Fall from Heaven. I've got another Jim Raines thriller that's in the hopper. First book was Coal Rains. This next book is called Killing Rains. And there are a couple more that are. I've got a few projects going.
Well, George, if people aren't familiar with you and your work, but they've liked what they've heard today, where would you steer someone to start going through your work? If someone wanted the ultimate George Wier experience, where would you start them?
Oh boy, well, the easiest thing to do is just get on your computer and type in www.georgewier.com. Now that is, I used to have two websites, the Bill Travis Mysteries website and the George Wier website. Well, I combined them together, so if you go to one, it defaults to the other. So you'll end up at BillTravisMysteries.com. But every book I've ever written is on there, and there are even links to some of the short stories and whatnot. And here's the thing, is that I not only encourage people to look at my books or whatnot, but if particularly if you like the books, I really encourage people to confab with me. People should email me. They should follow me on Twitter. They should, which is the thing, at Bill Travis Wright, W-R-I-T-E. They should follow me on Twitter. I friend people on Facebook all the time. I've got a huge following on Facebook. I've just now got a Minds.com account going. I'm kind of doing the alt tech now too. And I think I may even have I've got a girl that helps me with this stuff, but her name is Jessica. She's fantastic. I've even got a Gab AI account, I believe. But anyway, go to georgeweir.com. That'll take you where you need to go. But other than that, I really look forward to talking to people, readers who like the book.
Well, George, I've had a great time talking with you. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. We're going to send everybody over to georgeweir.com and place links to your most current works in the show notes. But, I'm going to tell everybody, if they go to your website, click on the books link and just scroll down and pick one of George's series and just go to book one and jump in. You not only are you one of the most prolific writers, but you write such a broad range of stuff. I feel like we didn't even really scratch the surface, but everything from steampunk to fantasy to sci-fi to traditional thrillers and Texas mysteries. George, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the show.
I was the one here at Advantage. I had all the fun. So thank you so much, sir. I really hope to come back someday and do it again. Let me get 30 more books out.
Well, I tell you what, the door's always open. If you need to come back, we're glad to have you. And if I learned one thing from our conversation today, is that the answer is always not yet.
No, yeah, not quite yet. Not quite yet. But you never know.
Yeah, you never know. Thanks for your time,
thank
George.
You, sir. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Tune in for new episodes every Tuesday and Friday. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
How do we know when we are watched? Do the eyes of a predator reflect moonlight, focusing it on our skin? Do we feel two little spots of white on our neck and bristle with fear? I knew I was watched, and I could feel its quality. A man's gaze, like yearning eyes in a smoky tavern. I felt drawn to it. I skirted the pond, and beneath a vine-choked bower, I found the horseman's severed head. The braid at the back had snagged on some twig, turning the dead eyes upward. A dragonfly rode his cheek. It fled as I reached for him. I took hold of his braid, like the vine of a pumpkin, and drew him from the water. We sat together on a mossy log, he and I. Oh, I felt such joy to look upon his face again. I wiped the mud from his lips and nostrils, preparing him to be buried. The Domine could not watch the graveyard always, I decided. I would wait for night to fall, steal a shovel, and do the work myself. A trio of colonial soldiers were raising a redoubt nearby. Thomas the gravedigger brought them his own long-handled shovels. He stood and watched the soldiers work with professional interest, as dirt was his trade. Autumn leaves snagged in his hair, but he was too busy tale-telling to notice. The morning's dark business had quite bewitched his imagination. But the big one was a Hessian. One of them horsemen. Head lopped off by a cannonball. He'll be a-haunting this place now, he will. With a hip-hip and a clippity-clop. I'll be seeing headless spooks in my burying ground. Just you wait. And if he can't find his own head, he'll be wanting one of ours. Lord love us. He shivered, hands in pockets. The soldiers laughed at him, but the boy was serious. Our legend had begun to spin itself already, from the lips of our tow-headed gravedigger. Fact and fiction going their separate ways, severed, as they often are. I listened with fascination. I had always loved a ghost story, and I'd never witnessed the birth of one before. Ghost stories are a form of history. If we say, 3 men died building that church and they forever haunt it, we keep those souls alive in death. Ghost stories are the past bleeding into the present, demanding acknowledgement of those unseen presences all around us, in our street names and genealogies and on our crumbling headstones. The tragedy of Old Willow, the fall of the horseman, the fate of you or I. These tales are forgotten by academic historians, who chronicle only great men. But our small lives are remembered, so long as our ghost stories are told. That is why we must tell them and retell them, and keep them kindled in the hearts of our children.